Hello again, Year 10. Welcome to your second lesson of home learning. You'll probably notice I've moved to a different area of the house. My daughter's requisitioned the area by the bookcase to ride her bike up and down. She hasn't noticed yet that I've nicked her whiteboard, so that's good. Right, our title for today is What Caused the Scramble for Africa? Between 1880 and 1900, Britain, alongside a lot of other European countries, Belgium, France, Germany included, between them took over pretty much the entirety of the continent of Africa. It was a huge change for that continent. It was divided up, carved up between the European powers, and Britain played a big part in that. So at the same time that the British Raj was in effect in India, Britain was also taking over large swathes of the African continent. What today's lesson is going to be about is why did that huge change take place? So if we have a look at a couple of maps first of all, these will give us an insight into the absolutely massive change that took place in Africa between 1880 and 1900. This first map here shows Africa in 1870, before the so-called Scramble took place. And we can see the continent's dominated by these kind of grey smudges which represent the indigenous African kingdoms and empires that had existed, lots of them since the Middle Ages, these powerful empires in the interior of the continent. If we look round the edge really carefully, I know you can't see this map that well, but these little red squares here, they represent where the British had kind of already established a bit of a foothold. The GC here stands for Gold Coast, that area we've studied in detail, where they built Cape Coast Castle in the 1670s. Now, although the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished by 1870, they still used the Gold Coast as a place to trade economic resources. And also, if we look down at the south of Africa here, Cape Colony, which was taken from the Dutch in 1795. Now, that was used as a kind of a stopping off point for ships going from Britain round the Cape of Good Hope all the way up to India over there. So the Europeans were really limited to just little nibbles around the edges of the African continent. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a second. But if we fast forward now to about 1900, the map has completely changed. Now this map here, the whole continent's been divided up. There are sort of specific borders have been drawn all the way across the continent, and these colours represent the different European powers. So the purple bits were the French, these yellow bits down here the Portuguese, orange for Germany, and then all the pink bits were Britain. Huge areas of the south, the east, the west of Africa have been taken over by Britain by this point. The only two countries, in fact, that hadn't been taken over by European powers by 1914 were Abyssinia, which is now called Ethiopia, and Liberia over here. The whole rest of the continent divided up by the European countries. And actually, if you are at all familiar with a modern day map of Africa, you'll notice that a lot of these borders are pretty close to the borders that still exist now. So what caused this huge change, this huge change whose consequences are still very much with us today? What was it that enabled or prompted all of the European countries, including Britain, to take over, carve up Africa between them? We're going to start by looking at another old book, just here, because this might give us a bit of a clue. This book's called Dr. Livingstone, the African Traveller. It was given to me a few years ago by a family friend. It is an original book from the 1870s. If we look carefully, this figure on the front is David Livingstone, or Dr. Livingstone as he was better known. He was a missionary, so a Christian who wanted to go and spread the Christian religion. If you look really carefully, he's got a Bible in his hand up there. And he explored through the African continent. And this book, Dr. Livingstone, the African Traveller, became a bestseller back in the UK. It really inspired a lot of people to try and follow in his footsteps. So if we have a little look at what's inside, you can see a picture of David Livingstone just here, flanked by some African figures. Now interestingly, up here we see an African man with chains that have been broken on his wrists. What's interesting about Dr. Livingstone was he, by this point the slave trade and Britain's involvement in it had ended, and one of his main driving forces behind his missionary work was to try and end slavery as it existed in other parts of Africa. And he saw Britain's role, really, ironically, seeing as how it had been such a big player in the slave trade earlier on, he thought Britain could play a big part in eradicating slavery from the globe. So we're going to have a look now at how Dr. Livingstone himself as a key individual and many other factors really combined to create the conditions where the scramble for Africa took place. So your first task is going to be to make a mind map a little bit like this one about the causes of Britain's involvement in the scramble for Africa. So you're going to use a textbook page I've scanned in, and there's a blank version of the mind map you can copy down, included on your worksheet as well. These are the factors we're familiar with from looking at our study of migration and empire. So individuals such as David Livingstone, the guy who wrote the book we just looked at, although he died in 1873 in Africa, that book inspired lots of people to follow in his footsteps and try and claim areas of Africa on behalf of Britain. They were backed up to some extent by the British government, or key people within it anyway, such as Lord Rosebery, who thought building up an empire was a good thing. The factor of war, or the desire to prevent war between European countries, prompted the Berlin Conference in 1884, when key figures from all the European countries got together in Berlin in Germany, looked at a big map of Africa and thought about how to fairly split the continent between them. Fairly from their point of view, they didn't really think about how African people felt about that. Clearly religion and economic resources played a part as well. You'll find that more detail to flesh this out looking in your textbook pages. And a really interesting one as well, technology. If we're thinking of the question, why did this happen in the late 19th century? There are two key bits of technology that helped with that. The Maxim gun, invented 1884, one of the first machine guns, enabling the British Army to kill large numbers of people in one go, particularly people such as from many African states who didn't have any guns of any kind to fight back. And then quinine. This one's not mentioned in the textbook. So quinine was the bark of a tree which was used from about 1870 onwards to treat malaria, which up until then had caused the deaths of most Europeans who, huge numbers of Europeans anyway, who ventured into the interior of Africa. So having a malaria cure was pretty effective as a way of persuading people it was a good idea and possible. So what I want you to do with this, first of all, is make notes under the headings using the textbook pages. The second thing I'd like you to do is try and find links between the factors. So for example, clearly David Livingstone was inspired by religion, and lots of religious people in turn were inspired by David Livingstone. So if you could somehow write those links onto your mind map, that would be really good. And the third thing is to consider which one possibly was the most important factor. Which factor was the most important for prompting Britain to get involved in the scramble for Africa? So that's our lesson for today. Next lesson we're going to have a look at what happened when people in Africa resisted the scramble, resisted the European invasion that was taking place, how they managed to fight back. We're going to focus on some African stories coming out of that. We're going to have a go at an exam question as well, hopefully. Now, just so you know, I'm going to set, I think the plan is I'm going to do 2 lessons a week for you. And we're going to have a little test at the end of each week as well, based on the stuff we've done. It's just going to be one of those multiple choice ones on Show My Homework. So we're going to try and settle into some sort of a routine where we can get used to this new way of learning. So I hope you're all well, hope you're all safe, and I'll be back with the next lesson soon. Cheerio.